I'm going to name a feeling and I'm going to ask you whether you recognize this. And so, if this is a heart, there's a heart, and you're looking out at what's happening in our world just now, certain aspects of what's happening in our world right now, and you feel your heart sinking. I'm just wondering, is this something anyone else feels? The sense of heart sinking and sometimes heart aching. I'm going to kind of hold it tight, heart aching. You may also feel at times your heart breaking. And today is about a response to that. I'm going to do this as a kind of physical motion. And this is too hard, by the way, I'm kind of beginning with. So there's something here about starting where we are, facing what we face, feeling what we feel, and embodying that fall, but then also catching our heart. And then if you kind of feel like an upward sense of energy into this posture here, I'm going to invite you to try this. Okay, here's me. And there will be times you might feel fine right now, but this is learning like a self-defense technique. Here, sinking down. And then there's a turn where you catch your heart and feel an upward motion and then like this. So it goes 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to invite you just to try this sometimes if you feel your heart sunk. If you find yourself feeling overwhelmed, and there might be about things in your life, there might be about things in the world, there might be you supporting someone else, and there's something here about form of healing martial art, where we marshal our resources and say, okay, I'm going to face this. I'm going to bring myself to this. The reason partly I'm doing this is I want to name a big threat to well-being out there, that we might have our hearts sinking, but this is really widespread. They did a big survey of 10,000 young people. More than half agreed with the statement, humanity is doomed. And I want to I want to put on the table for us to look at how we respond to one of the features of our time is a widespread collapse of hope. Now, you might think, why am I starting with all this depressing stuff? I thought this was going to be perhaps more uplifting. And I want to look at what helps us lift up, what helps us find that kind of upward rising of sap energy. But I need to name why we're doing this right at the beginning. And one of the reasons is I think there's different types of well-being. There's what I think of as business as usual well-being. Business as usual well-being is where we can carry on our business the way we usually do. And we're looking at a kind of well-being to support that. And there's also what I think of as through-topian well-being. And through-topian well-being is where we're recognizing that there's something to get through, that we're facing a time of danger and difficulty where many people have doubts about whether we will make it through. And you might too. There might be times where you might think just in the situations you face personally, am I going to make it through? Or the situations we face collectively, are we going to make it through? And the reason we're here today is I want to really look at how we responded to a design brief. There's been a group of us working on this for some years now. And we were thinking if we were to redesign a well-being practice to be a better fit for the 21st century, that as well as supporting personal well-being, it also addressed major threats to our collective well-being, like the climate crisis, the social unraveling that we're seeing happening at the moment, the war and the threat of war, and there's so many other issues that we could bring in, the absolutely massive inequality, the concerns about AI safety. You'll decide what are the concerns, what are the threats that really trouble you. But we're looking at how do we have a well-being practice that supports collective well-being by helping us find our part and play our part in contributing to positive change. it seems like every day there's something in the news that feel more like a dystopia, and a throughtopia is a story pattern of finding a way through. And throughtopian well-being is saying, well, to make it through, we're going to really need to pay attention to what helps us bring our best to whatever we face. That looking after our well-being while we're going through this in the best way that we can, that's part of it. And so that's what I want to look at. And I want to introduce this approach of Suha. And Suha really began with this design brief of what if, and this is a movement here, what if my hand um, is kind of representing these different fingers of thumb, different ways the future can go. There's better ways it can go, there's worse ways it can go. But what if we were to design some kind of healing martial art? And if we responded to that design brief of something that's fit for the 21st century, it would not only be personally helpful, but support our collective well-being. And I don't know about you, but I've been doing over the years dozens and dozens of different well-being practices, and quite often I start with enthusiasm and find it difficult to stick to. And so we're looking at how do we design a practice that's easy and fun to do, that's not just in our heads, even though it also engages and involves our heads and our thinking pathways, that is also bringing in our bodies, is embodied, bringing in proven practices, drawing on a range of sources. That's really what we set out to do, both new and old. So I've been very influenced by approaches like Tai Chi and also yoga, but also positive psychology and acceptance and commitment therapy. And I worked for nearly 20 years in mental health as a doctor and group therapist with people with addiction problems. And I learned a lot about change making skills that have really been something that I want to bring into this Suha approach. And we've consulted with lots and lots of people who are activists and change makers, behavioral change scientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, and range of people, yoga teachers, Tai Chi teachers, Qigong teachers, people drawn to this saying, and having conversations about how do we design and develop a well-being practice we can use. And it started out Suha, I'm talking really today, I'm focusing on supporting hope activation. But when we began doing this, we were really focusing on sustainable happiness. And what I mean by sustainable happiness, there's something here about bringing sustainability and happiness together, something that meets the needs of our world as well as ourselves. And I think of this as the beautiful life. The beautiful life is something that's good for us and other people and our world, rather than some approaches to well-being can be in avoidance of looking at what's difficult. The sense of I don't want to look at what's happening in the world because it will disturb my well-being. So I shut it out and push it away. We're looking here at a different approach where we can find our capacities, our strengths that help us face what's difficult and find our part in responding in a way that makes our lives more satisfying. And so this is a new development in Suha that just really happened over the last year, that we've moved from the central focus being sustainable happiness to seeing that these three elements, three dimensions of Suha, and each of them is a way of these words Suha can stand for. So they can stand for sustainable happiness. They can also stand for supporting hope activation, and we're going to be looking more at what that is and how we do it. But also, right here now, when we have those dip moments, when we feel our heart sinking, our heart aching, our heart breaking, that we can catch our heart, and supply healing activity. You might do this in front of a mirror. You might go in front of a mirror and just say, Chris, supplying healing activity. And you might think, well, what is that? What is supplying healing activity? And how do we do that? Healing activity is anything that supports movement in the direction of personal and or collective well-being. And it might be simple things like a statement of intention, an embodied orientation, where we're just saying, okay, I'm going to bring something to this. There's my suffering, and there's what I bring to it. There's the suffering in the world, and then what I bring to it as a response. And so the purpose of this, we're going to be introducing the idea of Suha moves. And from this webinar, you'll be able to take some Suha moves away that you'll be able to start using. But I also want to, we're telling the story of Suha, a story that can happen through us and it has purposes. So one is when we look at what's happening in the world, that we can support a shift from feeling overwhelmed, defeated, de-energized and heart sunk towards feeling more resourced, able to take steps that make a difference. But there's also a larger cultural shift here, a cultural shift from lives that are less satisfying, less sustainable, less socially transformative, to lives that are more satisfying, more sustainable, more socially transformative. And I want to bring in the idea that each Suha move is a prompt. It's a way of steering ourselves. It's a way of reminding ourselves to do things that we want to do anyway, but sometimes we can lose track of. And there's a core shift here. The core shift is from unsuha, and unsuha is a term for things that seem attractive in the short term, but actually make things worse in the long term. So you have a short-term gain, but a long-term cost. How can we reorientate ourselves personally and collectively to an approach where we do things that are attractive and we experience benefit from in the short term, but they also put out longer term ripples that support our future self, that supports other people's and supports our world. What I often say to myself is, what can I do today that I'll be happy about tomorrow? And what I'm doing when I say, what can I do today that I'll be happy about tomorrow, is that I'm building in a story. A story has a number of steps that I can look back on with a feeling of satisfaction. And that's very different from what I think of as the picture model of happiness. The picture model of happiness is everything in the picture needs to look just fine. I need to be smiling. And in a picture model of happiness, there's no room for distress and bad news. They're seen as threats to happiness, and so they're pushed away. But what that leads to is a collective response of closing our eyes and turning away and not addressing some of the most difficult things. Now, I just want to stop here because it might seem like, Chris, are you just saying that we have to give our attention to all that's happening in the world, even when it completely sinks us and we feel overwhelmed? And one thing I learnt from the recovery movement, working with people in addictions recovery, they have a saying, look, don't stare. Look, don't stare. And what I want to bring in is we look enough to feel activated. And this is what I mean by a hope activation. A hope is activated when it happens through us. What switches the hope activation off is where we want to blank out what I might think of as the activating signal of alarm. I saw a lot when I worked with people with addiction problems, a sense of in the short term, uncomfortable feelings are squashed down by drinking heavily. And it's a short-term fix that makes the problem worse. And this creates some, I'm grateful to Russ Harris for the term happiness trap, something that seems to make us happy, but actually makes us more miserable over time. And there's that happening with unsustainability generally, things that seem attractive in the short term, but cause problems in the long term. And I want to shift from that to this idea of a story of facing. A story of facing, but then Suha moves that help us deal with the sense of overwhelm, help catch our hearts when it feels aching and breaking and sinking, but also helps us find our part in a larger story. And you can apply this to problems in the world. you can also apply it to your own life struggles as well. We're going to be working with the idea that a hope is activated where it happens through us. So I'm still painting more of the picture and telling the story of Suha, and then we're going to try a Suha practice, and then I'm going to turn to my friend Madeline Young, and to talk a bit more, ask her to talk a bit more about Suha in practice, what it really looks like in practice. But I think what I'm going to invite you to do is whenever you're feeling struggling, either with your own life struggles or what's happening in the world, say, okay, this is the starting point, and there's a story here, and I need to bring something to this that helps me find my best response. Now, I've written here at the end, big happens through small. I think it's such a helpful idea. In fact, we've got a whole Suha move for it that I'm going to share with you now. Big happens through small. I do this like moving my arms around in a circle, and then I'm going to paint a little square. Like imagine if I had a pen in my hand. Like yeah, there we go. I've got a pen in my hand, and it's like I'm drawing a big circle and then a little square. And you might think, why do this? And I wanna tell the story behind that move because it's a meaningful move that reminds you of a different way of thinking about our power to make a difference. Big happens through small. There's a diagram here of a whole load of squares in the shape of a circle. And you could ask which square makes the circle happen? Well, none of them do by itself. You know, you might think, I want to make healing happen in myself and the world, but it's too big a thing. I can't do that. But if we shift from making something happen to helping something happen, each square here can help the circle happen. There's something larger happening through something smaller. And I'm influenced here very much by systems thinking. And that's one of the roots, one of the sources behind the Suha approach. So when I do this big happens through small, and a friend of mine, Mina, and using this in Lebanon, in Beirut, she says, big happens through now. When we say big happens through now, we're reminding ourselves that in each moment, there's steps we can take. They might be really tiny. It might be I look this way rather than that way. I turn up with an intention to play my part. I turn away from things that I know to be causing harm, even if they're attractive in the short term. I turn towards that which supports the flourishing of life in myself, in other people, and in our world. I think of this as the great turning. It's a story, it's a much larger story that happens through us. And Suha is a way of nudging ourselves, encouraging ourselves, guiding ourselves to find and play our part in this larger story in a way that supports this beautiful life that's good for us and also good for the world. So I want to come back to then this thing about, well, what do I mean by hope activation? Hope activation is different from being hopeful. It's possible to activate a hope even when you're feeling hopeless. When you ask yourself, what are my hopes? What you're reminding yourself of is that whatever you face, it can go different ways. There are better ways it can go and there are worse ways it can go. And even when things take a turning for the worse, there's still different ways it can go from there. So supporting hope activation starts by facing what we face. You know, here's me, I'm facing what I face, I'm feeling what I feel. But then I'm also recognizing this radical uncertainty that it can go different ways. There's better ways it can go. There's worse ways it can go. And even if things have turned out for the worse, even from there, it's still different ways it can go. There's better ways it can go and worse ways it can go. And so asking the question, what are my hopes from here? What do I hope for? And then it's being active to help your hope happen. Sometimes make my hope happen feels too big, too far away. But help my hope happen. Move in its direction, make it more likely. These are things I'm much more likely to be able to do. And so what the Suha process is this is what's behind it all. It's like saying, okay, how do I nudge myself. I'm holding this question. Here's me. I'm facing what I'm facing. I'm recognizing it can go different ways. And then I'm going, what if? What if it could go this way? What if it could? What's the best that could happen here? What's my deep hope? And if I could do something today that supports my hope, then maybe tomorrow I'll look back and say, I'm glad I did that.